We are now live.
Okay, so I think we can start our session. Hello and warm welcome to our session, Localized Risk and Spatial Planning Implications of Climate Change, where we will be discussing localization of climate data and climate action. Our session has two parts. For the first part, we have with us three speakers, Dr. Ivan Mallon from Georgia Tech, USA, to speak about climate science and localizing data. Ms. Ipsita Sirkar from Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction to speak about their experience working with communities most at risk. Professor Dr. Mutafutiwa Manda from Zusu University, Malawi, to present the learnings on blue-green infrastructure in the case of Malawi. For the second part, we have Professor Dr. Bruce Stiftel from Georgia Tech, USA, who is also the chair of the working group of planners for climate action. He will host a panel discussion with Professor Mi-Kam Eng and from Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Ms. Olafian Taibo, doctoral student at University College London, along with our three speakers who will join in with them. So I think we can start our session. Dr. Ivan Mallon, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. My name is Evan Mallon. I am senior analyst with the Urban Climate Lab and the School of City and Regional Planning of Georgia Institute of Technology, and a fellow in the Climate and Health Program in the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So I'm going to talk today about localizing climate data, shifting the conversation from international to individual. So I start off this talk with this news story from last year. Humidity and heat extremes are on the verge of exceeding limits of human survivability, study finds. And I bring this up just because I think that it shows well just what we're dealing with here and how bad this situation is really getting for us. And this is what we need to try and cope with. And so, of course, we frame climate change as a global issue. And of course, this is the scope at which we need to tackle it. But this is not the only scale on which we should be focusing our efforts. We know that climate change is impacting each and every one of our lives. And so we're shifting this conversation from the international perspective all the way down to the regional, city scale, neighborhood, household, and even to the individual. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about where the climate science is as we move down through these various scopes. So let's start with international. So of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar that the IPCC puts together these global climate change reports with projections now anywhere between about 1.5 and about 4.5 to 5 degrees C by 2100. And of course, when we deal with this kind of scale, that is a global average. That is not going to be the same kind of change that we see everywhere on Earth. So the poles you see here at around 4 degrees Celsius average global warming, the poles are actually only are all the way up to about 7 degrees C warming. So we get these kinds of regional differences that start to show up. And even though the resolution has improved with each IPCC report over the years, we still are not capturing the kind of detail that we need to really get to our actual individualized lived experience. And so we dig down into the regional scale, and we accomplish this through by shifting from the general circulation models, the GCMs, down to a regional climate model, or an RCM. This kind of downscaling gives us higher precision. It gives us a better resolution. But you can see in this example with the United States from our latest National Climate Assessment that we still are not seeing much in terms of heterogeneity that comes from the urban environment. We're still not really capturing that level of specificity with an RCM. And we know that in the recent example in the US, these kinds of regional differences can make a very big impact on people's lives. The recent Northwestern US heat wave in June of this year was almost 20 degrees C above normal. And this led to regional deaths of over 800 due to, as attributable to this heat. So this these regional differences can make a very, very big difference on our human health. And so when we talk about the human lived experience, we know that over 50% of the humans on Earth are now living in cities. And so from this scale downward is more what I am specialized in. What I tend to focus on is local climate change, or the kind of climate change that we see in cities due to the urban heat island, in addition to the global greenhouse effect. Both of them converge to create quite rapid warming in urban areas, as I said, known as the urban heat island effect. So all of our built environment, just the way that we are building our cities, are leading to this kind of local climate change, this acceleration of climate change. This graph here only shows a few degrees C warming, but it can actually get up to about 12 degrees warmer in urban areas as compared to proximate rural areas. And so when we track this over time, this is the 60 most populous cities in the United States. And we compare urban to rural weather stations. We see not only that shift upward due to the urban heat island, but in fact, this slope is steeper. And when we look at the cities that are seeing this kind of growing urban heat island, in fact, we see a 100% amplification of the rate of warming, which means that the way that we are building our cities is amplifying climate change by roughly 100% over the rural, that is the atmospheric rate that we're seeing in the background of all of this. And so we can dig down even further than that using some relatively newer technologies. So if we look into the neighborhood scale, we can actually model a city on a quite high resolution basis using tools like the Weather and Research Forecasting Model, or WRF. This is a dynamically downscaled model that lets us, in this case, for Louisville, Kentucky, run out of the Urban Climate Lab. We could run on a 1/2 kilometer grid. And so by running that kind of model, we can actually get the thermal heterogeneity of the urban heat island on a real high resolution neighborhood by neighborhood basis. You see here in terms of the daily minimum temperature, we have a range of 7.2 degrees C. So we are getting beyond that kind of global average worst case scenario of about 5 C when we start to just dig into the neighborhood scale based on how we have built our cities. Another way that we can do this is using temperature sensor networks. This example here is the Tech Climate Network on the campus of the Georgia Institute of Technology here in the United States, where we can see that on Georgia Tech's campus alone, we have an urban heat island intensity of 4.5 degrees C. That is our worst case scenario for 2100 on a global average. So just depending on your local environment, you can have a very different thermal experience. In fact, one way that I like to illustrate this is looking at the number of hot days. This example is in the summer of 2017. So over the 92 days of summer, areas that were heavily exposed, no vegetation, lots of that kind of built up impervious space. At 53 days, that exceeded a threshold of the 90th percentile hot temperature for Atlanta. So that's the temperature at which even Atlantans begin to sweat. Versus these more heavily canopied areas, the cooler areas only exceeded that threshold 7 days. And so depending on the type of neighborhood that you live in, you will be personally feeling a fundamentally different summer, depending on how you've built that local environment. Well, we can go even deeper. We can go to the household scale. Researchers such as myself have been starting to model interior temperatures that are also sensitive to these outdoor ambient temperatures that we've been modeling for many decades now. And so in this particular study, we've coupled the ambient temperatures from the WRF model with Energy Plus for interior temperatures for a simulated heat wave and blackout. So under normal conditions, we have the air conditioning running and we cut the power and we run these models again just to see how bad it can get. In a city like Phoenix, Arizona, we find that cutting off the power in a one-story single-family home can increase that interior temperature by 21.5 degrees C. That is an extraordinarily high shift in temperature over a very short amount of time. And that is extraordinarily dangerous for human health. When we translate that into a heat index, using the National Weather Service classifications, we see that that one-story single-family home is in danger category. That is with heat stroke possible. So as soon as people start to lose that air conditioning, they become very at high risk of heat stroke or other such heat-related conditions. In fact, we found when we ran this for 3 different cities in 3 very different climates, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Detroit, that when the power is cut, there are 0 residential structures that are at this no risk category. They're all at least in caution all the way up to danger. And this changes actually the way that we think about this kind of heat exposure, what climate change may mean for these cities, because we found that what we call the UHI penalty, or the difference in interior temperatures between the warmest and coolest areas of a city, was actually much smaller than what we call the housing penalty, the difference in interior temperatures between the warmest and coolest building type for each city. So depending on what kind of housing you live in, you may be exposing yourself to very different temperatures. Well in excess of that global average temperature that I discussed at the beginning. And so the real cutting edge here is going all the way to the individual. If we truly want to get to the lived experience of individuals, we need to be modeling climate change or monitoring climate change at that scale. And so the emerging science on this is actually to use synthetic population data sets that come from the epidemiological literature. In order to best model what this kind of temperature, this thermal landscape looks like for a given individual. So I've circled just someone here. This dot actually represents a 42-year-old male. He's got an outdoor occupation. He doesn't have access to air conditioning at home, and so on and so on. To really fully understand that thermal landscape. And this is the scale at which we really need to be shifting, because as I showed in the beginning, the temperature regime globally is really getting beyond what we are culturally able to survive. And we are changing our cultural practices as a result. This is an example of Phoenix, Arizona, where construction work has had to move to night in order for these construction workers to actually survive those daytime temperatures. They're sleeping instead. And so each of these different scales has different implications on planning. And so we need to be addressing this issue at each of these different scales to truly understand, what does this mean for us? And so that is all that I have to say on the topic for now, but I look forward to the discussion, and hopefully that set the stage a little bit for just the scope of what we're dealing with and the kind of data that we can use to drive our decisions.
Thank you, Dr. Evan. So I think we will go on to our next speaker and maybe take the questions in the panel discussion. Meanwhile, I would encourage everyone to please take a note of their questions for the speakers and maybe put it up in the chat box. So next we have Ms. Ipsita Sirkar. Over to you.
Thank you, Lola. Good morning, everyone. So, just to introduce myself, I'm Ipshita Sarkar, and I work at the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. I am the regional coordinator for South and Central Asia. I am also the global lead for urbanization at the Secretariat of GNDR. So, just before we go a little further into what I have to say for today's session, just a bit of a brief background about GNDR. So GNDR is the largest international network of organizations committed to working together to improve the lives of people affected by disasters worldwide. As a network, we have about 1,500 members across 640 organizations in 128 countries. And we are committed to collectively pursue the work of building the resilience of communities most at risk, who are disproportionately affected by different interconnected and systemic risks. These are also communities who are disproportionately exposed to the various forms of marginalization and discrimination, which actually only makes them more vulnerable to the risks that they face. So, moving forward, in the past few years, we have seen a growing collective conscience globally on the need to work for building resilience of communities. But despite the variety of global and national efforts that are being made, time and again we are finding that lives are being devastated by floods, droughts, disease, food shortages, poverty, conflict, and pandemic. This brings us to the question to question the very methods that we are following to build resilience. Are we really building resilience of communities? Are people really being able to, are being empowered or being, can you say, have the ability to face a risk and not get wiped out, or not get affected, their lives itself or their livelihoods get affected by the risks that they are facing. And when we're talking about risks here in this context is climate change risk, disaster risks, also risks that they face from unplanned urbanization. So in that context, how much are we really actually being able to empower the communities most at risk? And when we are talking about the communities most at risk at GNDR, we are talking about the communities who live in maybe who are the poorest of the poor. They're the communities who live in the urban slum, in the urban squatter areas, who are not part of the planned and the institutional urban setup that we are used to, and that as planners, that who when we work with these when we work in a city, these are not communities who are part of what the municipality or the government system is actually including as a part of it. These are fringe communities. These are communities who are not included in these in the discussions or are not accounted for. So the point is that at GNDR we believe that if we are to build lasting resilience, it is only when we are able to listen to the voices of these communities who are most at risk, who are at the front lines, who have absolutely no security net, and try and understand their context and their lived in experiences. And when we are able to do that, will we actually and be able to build their resilience, that we will be very naturally also be building the resilience of everybody else living in an urban setup. And the role of CSOs, of civil society organizations, in facilitating this process of including communities in the planning of these communities most at risk, in the planning, resource allocation, and decision making processes with the local government, is extremely crucial. To further elaborate, I would like to bring up the examples of GNDR's flagship program, which is Views from the Frontline. And we have run it over 4 times, and the last iteration was in 2019. In which we conducted a survey for more than 118,000 people on the ground in 712 communities in across 50 countries and across the various regions in the world globally. Representatives of local government, civil society organizations, and communities most at risk were interviewed as a part of VFL 2019. And we were able to identify, based on the data that we collected, the major reasons why people are still losing their lives and livelihoods to disasters. And these are their total 8 in number, and they are as follows. First is that complex threats need integrated solutions. But the non-structural prevention measures are vital, but they are often overlooked. We are not, when there is a climate change, and when there is environmental degradation, and when there is a disaster, the community on the front line is not experiencing them separately. They're experiencing them as one whole in integration, and it's a complicated, overlapping threat that they are facing. So we need to have integrated solutions at the local level. And it is not just structural measures of putting up a wall, or constructing something that is going to prevent or reduce their risk. They're non-structural measures, as in building their resilience, teaching them, setting up early warning systems, teaching them evacuation protocols. That is very, very vital. But very often these are very quickly overlooked, because they require time, they require effort, and they require community ownership, which also requires another set of time and effort to build. By the effects of climate change, of disasters, they are not involved by the decisions on how to reduce their own risks. So while climate change on the ground is experienced by the communities most at risk, they are not necessarily included in the process of their planning, mitigation, adaptation measures, right? And a crucial aspect of ensuring community participation is the planning processes. And what we found through the survey is, very often when these planning processes take place, even if at the community level, it's not at a time or in a location that is convenient for the communities most at risk to attend and participate. And it must be kept in mind that these are the most vulnerable sections of communities, who are often, their time is, they earn a living based on daily wages, or their time is committed. So taking out time to participate in local level planning processes is something that they don't have, and the effort has to be made to involve them. And the onus of making that effort lies on the planners, on the civil society organizations, on the local government systems, rather than on the community themselves. The third point that we found, what prevents communities from building their resilience, is the clarity of that there is no clarity on responsibilities. So at the local government level, there is no designated department or legal mechanism for assessing and addressing the threats that communities face at the local level. There isn't someone dedicatedly working on building resilience of the communities at risk. There is also, because of that, there is also the fourth aspect of where there is a gap in information, where national governments are producing a lot of information. Academia is producing a lot of information, but it is not trickling down to the communities who need it the most, whose lives are being affected, and that information would actually be life-saving to them. Then there is the aspect of absence of funding, where communities do not have direct access to funds to build their own resilience. Very often funding at the local level is very tied up, very structured, and very limited to, it is only for education purposes. It is only to, even if we say in education, it is only to build the building, build the toilets, provide the books, provide a midday meal. But sometimes building resilience may require you to move out of these boxes of where the funding is allocated for, and to draw funding from that to build, say, school resilience at the community level. But then when the funding is so extremely tied up in into tight boxes, it is not easy for the communities to raise those resources that they require to be able to build their resilience. Then there is also no systematic way to capture and share the lived in experiences of communities most at risk. So, what a community may be sitting in an urban slum in the city of Delhi is experiencing is not something that at the international or the national level that the governments and decision makers and planners are know about and are factoring in when they are making their various plans and policies to build for resilience building or for urban planning for that matter. Further on is the fact that which pretty much brings us to the fact that the development, therefore, that governments are working on and are investing in are not risk informed. And as a result, when a local level development project is being implemented on the ground, it very rarely takes into account the existing or projected climate risks that are being experienced by those communities or that are expected to be experienced by those communities at the front line. Using higher resolution data set is not going to be able to provide a community contextual specific what do you call it, a contextual specific approach to building the resilience of that particular community itself. And this also brings about the fact that this calls for the need, and what is lacking is the lack of coherence between different approaches. So very often, like I've already mentioned, there is work that is happening in parallel on climate change, on disaster risk reduction, on environmental degradation, on development. All of these, at the end of the day, risks are experienced as one complex bundle by the community. It is not experienced in silos, and therefore there is a need to understand the interlinkages and the coherence across these risks that are experienced by the communities. So based on these findings, at GNDR, we understood that if anyone is to really build the resilience of the communities most at risk, in the most truest and purest sense of the word, we really want to build the resilience of communities, then there are two approaches that have to be adopted. The first being localization and the second being risk-informed development. We see both of these aspects as two sides of the same coin. That is, localization on one hand enhances risk-informed development by enhancing local engagement and leadership, while risk-informed development supports localization as it emphasizes the need to take on both the risk experienced by communities and their view on community resilience. When we say localization, we mean local civil society organizations and people most at risk are able to participate, influence, and take decisions on risk informed development policies and practices. It refers to the structural changes in local, national, and international levels where local actors have the capacities, resources, and power they need to decide on how to strengthen their own resilience. So, an essential aspect of localization is not just transferring financial resources to local level in higher amounts than those currently available. Of course, that is important, but it's not just that. It is also enhancing capacities of local communities to meaningfully participate in decision-making processes, creating effective governance and accountability mechanisms so that the participation of communities is effectively considered and it's not just a tokenistic exercise. Creating an enabling policy environment, especially at the national level, that supports the delegation of responsibilities and decision-making powers of local actors, creating linkages horizontally between different sectors and different aspects of development and resilience, and linkages vertically also between local, subnational, national, and international levels and actors. It is not about doing local work in isolation. It is not about building the resilience of only one community, but it is also about recognizing that we all live in a global village where all of our lives are interconnected and our localities are connected. Something that I think the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly driven home to us in the past 1.5 years. So therefore, while we focus on building the resilience of one local community, we also need to focus on linking them with other local communities and help them, one leader connect to another leader so that they can join forces and advocate for change for themselves. And at the same time, we also recognize that some risks are global in nature, and so you may need to take what we call a global approach, which is a global overview but action at the local level. Further on, it is also important to recognize that everyone plays a role in localization, be it the communities themselves, the civil society organizations, the local actors, academia. Everyone plays a role in the localization process. And the role of CSO specifically is facilitative in nature, because they understand engagement and they understand how to facilitate community leadership. And this and there also needs to be a focus on, therefore, if everyone is playing a role, the focus needs to be on collaboration and partnership, so that localization is streamlined and scaled up. Moving forward, other than the aspect of localization is the aspect of risk-informed development. And risk-informed development is development that is informed by the understanding of various risks and risk drivers, both short and rapid onset, implications of these risks, and the vulnerabilities of people, communities, and landscapes and systems. Such that development choices and decisions address these risks via adaptation, mitigation, preparedness, and resilience building, so that we can deal with multiple and complex risk scenarios in the present and the future. It aims to avoid creating complex risks through poor development choices, reduce complex risks by using development to reduce vulnerability and exposure and increase resilience, and also to promote iterative and constant learning to improve sustainable development and resilience. So we recognize that every community and the landscape that they live in is unique. And from that perspective, the CSOs who are working in those contexts also understand the nuances of engagement in these contexts. So the process of risk-informed development that we are advocating for is, to facilitate communities to make informed decisions, to realize their own aspirations as a community, to recognize their issues, their roadblocks that are there in their own, their path of progress and growth, and therefore find the solutions themselves for this. So this kind of turns conventional planning processes and practices on its head. It's a little different. It is it is calling for replacing the traditional conventional planning processes with more dynamic and iterative processes, where the landscapes and communities are transforming, and to that extent this transformation is built into the planning processes. It is embraced and part of the planning processes, so that we keep on revisiting the development planning processes and ensure that these changes and this dynamism is built in, and therefore the development is up to date, is contextualized to the risks and the changing phenomena of risk that communities experience. Under one of our projects, which is the Local Leadership for Global Impact project, we are developing a risk-informed development toolkit and guideline, in which we recognize 3 broad stages for risk-informed development planning. The first phase is where we define or redefine baselines, where communities understand their aspirations, their visions for their future, the information and evidences of the conditions and situations in which they are living in, with respect to their own lives, with the systems, with the environment in which they live in. Moving forward, then, based on this information, being able to analyze and assess the risks and the interdependencies of the risks that they are experiencing, and therefore be able to anticipate and foresee conditions in the future, and then prepare and build their resilience in that direction. And then further is to be able to act on these by coming up with strategies and act on these strategies um, where they are able to successfully identify the required strategies and actions to achieve their goals and resolve the issues, and translating them into reality. And to implement these strategies, the manpower, the financial resources are also critical, and it is also important for the strategy actions to be in coherence and not create conflict among each other and create further risks in the future. So to sum up, we see communities at the center as the protagonists of their own stories of resilience building. We see them as participating, influencing, and taking decisions on risk-informed development policies and practices. And this is done based on the premise that communities themselves have the critical knowledge and experience of the threats they face and the consequences, as well as the knowledge of the actions they need to take to help reduce the risks. So thank you very much. That's about what I had to share today.
Thank you, Ipsita, for sharing those very insightful learnings from your experience at GNDR. So we have one more speaker with us, but then we will have him join us soon. Meanwhile, we could probably take a few questions. And for that, I would like to invite Professor Bruce Stiftel from Georgia Tech to take on the questions. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Good Wednesday, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll welcome two panelists who haven't spoken yet, Mi-Kam Ning from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Olafian Tewo from the Commonwealth Association of Planners and University College London in England. As Lolia has indicated, there is a third scheduled speaker, Professor Mutafu Manda from Malawi, who unfortunately was double scheduled. And so he is presenting in another session right at this time. And we're hoping that he will get to us shortly so that he can give us his presentation on blue-green infrastructure. But let's open a panel discussion. And some of you have entered questions in the chat. I'll encourage others who are in Zoom to put additional questions in the chat so that we can pose those to the panelists. We have some other questions that have come in before the session as well. And so we'll take those in turn. Let me start with a chat question for Evan Mallon. So Evan, you talked about the housing effect, and the question is whether you can say more about that, perhaps speaking to what kinds of housing types have the greatest effect, and how we as communities should respond to this housing effect.
Yeah, so this is a great question because this was a huge eye-opener for us and us as researchers who have been doing this work for a very long time. The paradigm has been that we, at very best, model ambient temperature at high resolution across the city. But we're not sitting outside all the time. We spend a lot of our time indoors, particularly now during the pandemic. We spend all the more time indoors. And so with this study, where we're modeling different housing prototypes and the interior temperature exposures that result from them, we're finding that this, what we call the housing penalty, that is the difference between the warmest and the coolest housing types within a city, is so much larger than the UHI penalty, the urban heat island penalty, that is comparing the warmer and cooler areas of a city within housing type. And so what we found is that Generally, buildings with a high roof area to volume ratio are the ones that most quickly and intensively warm up. So that's where we have the one-story single family that warms up almost 20 degrees C because it has quite a large roof area that can soak up the sun. So that heats up in the sun, and that relatively small area means that they're basically living in a small oven. Versus something like a two-story single-family structure that has a smaller roof area to volume ratio. And then the coolest we actually found to be a three-story apartment building. And so the conventional wisdom was that apartment buildings would be the warmest because that hot air rises. We've been living under that paradigm for a very long time, but what we found is that the high volume of that building, there's a certain thermal inertia to it, where it takes a very long time to heat up. It also takes a long time to cool down, but because of that kind of cooling property of that thermal inertia, that actually remained one of the cooler building types in all three of our cities for all of our models. So yeah, plenty more to say on that, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Evan. Are there others on the panel who would like to add something? Then let me turn to Ipshita and ask a question again from the chat, whether you can give us some examples of communities where either CSOs or universities or research institutes or others have helped to actually carry out the kind of resident-based decision-making process that that you and GND are advocating.
Right. So in the VFL 2019 project itself, the first phase was collecting the data, but the second phase was analyzing the data for each community and taking the data back to them and saying that, okay, you have recognized these as your risks and these are the barriers of your risk. So how can we apply now? How can we work together and come up with solutions to addressing these risks and building your resilience? So the 700 plus communities that I mentioned that were part of the VFL 2019 project are all being facilitated by the CSOs who have facilitated the data collection to implement this kind of risk-informed development, coherent approaches to be able to address their risk. Further, again, we have another project which is called Making Displacement Safer project, in which again we are implementing the project in 13 countries, and this is specifically for urban for basically refugee population or displaced population in urban areas, and where again we are trying to facilitate a process through urban living labs where we want the communities to again we have used a lighter model of the VFL survey and conducted a survey among those communities to understand their own risks, and then we are going to be working with the communities and also be calling in academia in this project, where we are going to try and find innovative solutions to the problems that they are facing. But it's going to be community-led, community-driven, and also the solutions at the end of the day based on localized resources and that are available. So that is how we are looking at implementing the Making Displacement Safer project. And there are many more other examples globally where in community resilience that we are building is moving more in the direction of it being community owned and community led process. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there other panelists who want to add anything, perhaps examples from your experience? Mikam, please go ahead.
I actually don't have anything to add because I really admire the work of Ipshita. I just wonder in that process, that community-driven kind of processes, what is that linking, with government, those aspects as to oil the whole process so that it's smoother and really beneficial to the local communities.
Right. So, say for example, in Indonesia and in the Philippines, when we did the VFL 2019 pilot in Philippines, the community when they are doing that planning process, they are also involving the local. Government representatives as a part of it. So when they come together to review their risks and their data and the inputs that they have put in, and they hold a community consultative workshop or a meeting, they invite the local government representative to be a part of this process. And then in that process, they discuss that these are the issues we are facing and what would be the probable solutions that they can come up with. And in that process, the local government representative also kind of plays a role in suggesting what are the available government policies or funding or mechanisms that or programs that are available at the local level that they can leverage to implement the solution that they want to come up with. So and as a process of that, they trial it and they pilot it and they see it works. Then when it works, then in the Philippines, our partner organization, what they were able to do was take it up to the national advocacy level, and they were able to bring changes in the national disaster management policy, saying that these aspects of planning need local community participation and involvement. So, and another example I can say from India through another project that I have an experience of is like where they were working with agricultural communities, and the farmers felt that they were being affected by floods on a regular basis, and their crops were being damaged. So when they called the local government representative, and they also called the local research institute on farming practices, which is also a government-led institute, being part of this planning process, they were then advised that they can take the resistant seed variety which can withstand flooding for a period of time, and is built. It is a variety of seeds that does not crops are not damaged because of that. And then they were also told under which program and which center they can go and actually access these seeds from. So that is how the community is informed about the available resources that the government has, and the government is also made aware of the challenges that the communities are facing on the ground, so that their research institutes also work in that direction to finding solutions for the communities. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, thank you both. Let me turn to a question from Ikam about the search for and choice of strategies and solutions. I think that it's often the case that local governments are they will look at what their peer cities are doing, the cities near them and the cities like them in their multinational region, but they are reluctant to try things that haven't been already tried by those peer communities. In your experience, what are strategies that can be used that are effective in getting local governments to be willing to search more broadly and to try things that are not already proven in their peer group? You're muted, I think.
So I think,
this was a question from Ikam, but
okay. Yeah. No.
Have your addition afterwards, Ipshita.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce, for the question. In Hong Kong, our government, we don't have democracy. Our government is not an elected government. So that actually makes the whole thing more difficult. It's very difficult to change the mindset of the bureaucrats. So maybe I can say that we can summarize our approach by 3 Ps. The first P would be like by peer pressure. So a number of us, would try to say, for instance, we publish works on some of the more cutting edge strategies or actions for combating climate change. That works in other contexts. Say, for example, like integrated treatment of infrastructures, the importance of having smart grids, etc. And I would try to put it into a publication. And if resources allow, we have a very big book launch, which invite everyone. If we don't have the budget, we have a seminar or whatever. We invite, our peers or government officials to come so that they know that these are, workable solutions and they are important. That's one. The other is I would call persistent advocacy, a bit like what Ipsita has been doing, but her scale is just mind-boggling for me. So what we do is planners working in private consultants, if they get commissioned government projects, or for me as an academic research planner, I do community planning projects as well. So we try to sort of really look into the local situation, and trying to convince either the government or the local communities that climate resilience is important, identifying useful information and try to sensitize them to the risks of climate change, sea level rises, which will have impacts on local communities or on areas that the government want to develop. So it's almost like hammering, these ideas and concepts into the brains, whether it's government officials or local communities, so that they realize the importance of, climate resilience. The third P, I would say, productive research, a little bit like what Dr. Mallon has just presented, or like the kind of more softer but equally important work, that ISEPTA has tried to convey to us, so that we can sort of, when we do good research, we can illustrate whether it's scientific modeling, the importance of certain climate events on, say, facilities, or the more softer side, the soft institutional setup that are required, like integrated thinking, like what ISIPTA has mentioned, in order to combat climate change. Of course, in reality, planners in the consultants, they cannot be too radical in a sense, because they rely on the government for jobs. But so that probably would rely more on people like myself. We're in the academia, and so we can do the 3 Ps as well, so that hopefully we're creating a situation when planners inside sort of the institution and outside are working together to introduce these more innovative ways of combating climate change.
So I just want to ask you what the second P was. I missed the title.
Oh, sorry, persistent advocacy. Persistent advocacy. It's basically, advocacy. I just try to put the P so that people can remember it.
Sure. So Ipshita, you were going to say something in response. Do you want to go ahead?
No, I think she covered the point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Others who want to add something on this question? Olivia?
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Mita. That was actually very detailed. Just to add to what you have mentioned, I think an important aspect is the multidisciplinary approach. So, for example, most of the time, local authorities do not usually work together, they work in silos. But drawing experiences, drawing disciplines together to assess steps, innovations, and approaches would always yield more result. And there is always the likelihood for, depending on the area, for the elected members to really accept that idea, because it's not just coming from one particular discipline, it's coming from the different departments. That's one. And I think the other approach that as what is actually identifying the risk of the new ideas, and also detailing the different measures to mitigate the risk ahead of time. And so when this is being used, we've seen that the chief executives or the members in this case are more receptive to trying untested measures and approaches before. And I'm looking forward really to seeing how in academia, how researchers, the reports, will, rather than drawing from the exact projects in terms of examples from other projects, but looking at the process and the methods that have been used. So in this way, if we were talking about, for example, when we're talking about climate adaptation, probably in coastal areas, we look at how they have looked at the resources available to them in that particular area to mitigate the climate risk, rather than looking at what exactly they have done. I think that's some of the approaches that would make the local authorities and elected members who are also concerned about returning to the role or to the post that they owed and being accepted by their constituencies. This would make them more receptive to untested ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Olifian, let me ask you a question about capacity building for planning. In so many countries, especially in South and Southeast Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't have the planning workforce that's needed to be able to do the kind of climate action planning that is being advocated here. What strategies can we use to increase the capacity in those communities amongst other professionals and amongst residents to be able to have the planning expertise that they need in order to do this work?
Thank you, Bruce. I think one of the most important things that we planners on our side need to do is to raise the awareness of the importance of planning to climate adaptation and mitigation. This is a major step that needs to be taken. Looking at, definitely there is a shortage of planning professionals, even to carry out core planning roles in the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South and Southeast Asia. So this is definitely expected that in climate adaptation roles, this would also happen. But if we raise the awareness of the importance of planning, then it's time to start considering planning in these roles, the importance of planning to these roles before we even take any step at all. I think I'll just mention two categories. In terms of short-term actions that should be taken, I think we need to introduce short introductory courses, short courses on the concepts, on the ideas, on the emerging areas of planning. We need to make these courses available to non-planners who are taking on climate roles. This is very important because it would introduce these non-planners to the concepts. It would also enlighten them about why they need to start considering planning and further planning initiatives in their approach to resolving, to designing even the climate adaptation projects and processes that they want to take. This is very critical. And I think a second one would be creating knowledge sharing platforms. P4CA, for example, is a platform for knowledge sharing among planners in different sectors, academia, CSO, public sector and private sector, but going beyond that to create a platform that flows organically, but that creates that opportunity for knowledge sharing, for innovation sharing as well, and probably for a collaboration, not just sharing of knowledge and ideas, but for collaboration. In the long term, I believe that multidisciplinary approach to learning is very critical to resolving this shortage, and that is introducing concepts, planning concepts, the core planning theories, emerging themes into educational programs of other built environment professions and other similar professions are now working in the climate action rules. So this makes sure that rather than firefighting approach, where we are now addressing the problem from immediate issues, we would then be addressing the long-term, the potential issues, and we are also then also creating that awareness for planning as a profession and for the importance of from the early stage. So we can have these multidisciplinary courses either at tertiary level going up or at a vocational level as well, to ensure that not just because we are very much aware that these roles will be taken not just by graduates from universities, but also by vocational professionals. So introducing these core modules, making it compulsory in a way, because we live in a spatial environment at the end of the day. So making it mandatory at this level will then address in the long term the shortage. Thank you.
Thank you, Olafia. And I'm thinking about the intersection between what you've been discussing and what Ipshita presented on before in terms of community service organizations. I think about the work that Slum Dwellers International has done, that Mahila Housing Trust has done in India, that Habitat for Humanity International has done in many communities. These are NGOs that have really built planning knowledge and other kinds of contextual knowledge amongst residents in communities, so that those residents then take the lead in adopting or in implementing planning solutions. Seems to me there's a lot of potential for that in the countries in which the planning workforce is not sufficiently large. Others who want to add on the capacity building issue? Yes, Mikem.
Like in Hong Kong, different professional institutes like planning, surveying, landscape architects, sometimes even engineers. We work together to do kind of like knowledge transfer activities, so these things usually are not just for professional members, but also open to the public. And the talks very often will be then being put on YouTube, etc. So other can actually access those kind of knowledge. Sometimes we also write to newspapers to create some debates or concerns surrounding climate-related issues. We think that's quite useful as well.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat that comes from Matrei Koduganji. And Matrei, I wonder if you would want to turn on your video and audio and ask the question yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm also rapporteuring for this session, so I have a little critical questions to ask. So this is especially in case of India. One is that, of course, we're talking about awareness, we're talking about knowledge sharing, but the minute we talk about local communities, it sort of intersects with where they come from, where they belong, and their ethnicity. And because I've been working in that space, this has been a very major roadblock for us to even have people participate in such a decision-making process. So I wanted to ask if this has been your experience, and if this has this, how do you really tackle something like this? Because that's a major block towards participation and access to such kind of decision-making platforms. Yeah.
And so you have in mind the roadblocks that governments put in place, or the roadblocks that the residents themselves put in place?
Not government per se, but perhaps the roadblocks during the interaction between the residents and organizations.
Thank you. Who would like to respond to that question? Ipshita, please.
Okay, I give it a go. So, when you enter a community as a CSO, you may not enter with you cannot maybe enter with the thing that, okay, now we're going to come in here and we're going to plan for your risks and build your resilience and address your the problems and vulnerabilities that you have. So you have to actually enter a community with the available hook that community has. You have to find an available hook. So it may be around something related to their water and sanitation needs, maybe around their education needs or health and hygiene or women's safety. So you have to enter with a particular hook into the community. And there's a rapport building process that by constantly engaging with these communities, that you are able to build a rapport with them, that you earn their trust, that they trust you as someone who has a set of capacity, a certain set of knowledge, and also that you have their best interests at heart. You're not there to just come and uh, lecture them or tell them how certain things need to be done, but rather work with them to find their solutions in their for their problems. Because also we need to recognize that uh, we as CSOs, when we get into these communities, we have our constraints. We have our funding constraints. We have our own strategic organizational constraints, which may also mean that at certain point in the future, we may or may not be engaging with these communities. So to make these communities self-sufficient, self-reliant, empowering them is an underlying concern and something that we must always keep in mind when we are building rapport, so that these solutions come from within themselves, for what works for them, what is sustainable in the future, irrespective of whether there is the CSO presence there or not. That said and done, when you start a process of participatory planning, it is very often in the beginning that the most marginalized sections of these communities, and in the Indian context, like Maitreyi said, there is inherently the society is structured around caste and gender, and there are different aspects which would structure that community. So when you call community members to participate, the most marginalized, the poorest of poor, will not be part of that group, right? But and you start off the process, but you will find that you will come to a point when you are engaging and you are facilitating this collaborative process, that you will come to a point where the discussion will veer in the direction of the most marginalized. So it's either like you're making a community level hazard vulnerability assessment map, and you draw out the map, and you say, okay, this happens here, this happens here, what happens in that corner? And they'll say, oh, it doesn't matter, and then you have to say, no, but it matters because it affects them. And what if it affects them and it comes to you? If there's a health hazard and they get affected, then it can come to you. So explaining to them those interlinkages, like we said, the very fact that we live in a global village, and what is happening in one community affects the other parts of the same community, but also affects other communities and eventually globally. So to that extent, slowly building that trust and saying that, no, so we need to understand what happens there, let's invite them. So it's a slow process, it's an iterative process, you have to keep on at it, but eventually there will be a time where there will be a whole community approach, where these barriers of caste, of these barriers of gender will get addressed. So in the beginning, you may also find only the men attending these sessions. Women will not be there, children will not be there, because they'll say it's not important for them to be there, but then trying to tell them, yes, but from our experience drawing up, saying, okay, but if the men are not there at typically in India, you may see that they go to work and the women are the ones who are staying back in the community. So what happens if there's a risk that is experienced in the daytime when the men are not there? So then what happens then? So that's when they recognize the need for integrating women into the planning processes. So we have to, as CSOs, facilitate and help them see the other side of the way they are looking at it, and therefore integrating and bringing in other people and collaborating with an all society approach, and bringing in everyone into the planning processes.
Pshita, I so agree that building trust is a slow process. And then I think about the decade of decision and the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals time horizon, and the incredible pressures of time that climate change are bringing, and thinking we don't have the time. and that yes, we need to build trust, and that takes time, but the time just isn't there. And this to me is a real challenge. Others who would like to add on this question?
Yeah, what Ipshita said, I think, rings very true in my own work as well. I mean, a lot of what I do is heat vulnerability modeling and mapping. And what we found is that the response is necessarily iterative. You know, we have to use those maps to go into the communities, but then to find those community champions to actually discuss with them what are the needs of this community, how can we best address this? Because there's so often we can come up with a solution that, you know, according to our models is the best solution. We come to the community, no one wants to uphold it. You know, we say you are lacking trees will cool you down, and they say we don't want to maintain any trees, we don't want to look after them here. And so this is a necessarily iterative thing. And so I think that it does take that time to build. And speaking to Bruce's point that he just made, very little of my presentation was about the projections, about looking forward. Actually, everything about the localized data sources that we're dealing with are dealing with issues today. And so this is something that where I think we've kind of almost run out of time. And that is, I think, an important part of our communication strategy is that we are not looking forward to 2030 or 2050 or 2100. We are looking into the disparities that we have now. I mean, that model that I showed with the air conditioning versus no air conditioning, that no air conditioning is the lived experience of many people on the planet, even in the United States. That is their everyday experience. And so, you know, I think framing the issue is really that we are out of time and that we do need to be handling this right now. And that is certainly a difficult thing to do, as Bruce said, that it takes so much time to build this trust, to have these iterations with the community.
Thank you. So, Evan, let me ask you a question about climate science. Now, there's so much talk now that we've moved into a post-fact society, in which the most straightforward of evidence is questioned, and you know, the climate science is largely done at a global level. It's the scientists will often come in and present what they understand to be consensus-based evidence. And so often now we're hearing in local communities with the rich access to data that everyone has now through the internet, that people will contest what the official scientists are saying and will say that the story is different, and want to argue that the foundation on which the policy program has been built is a faulty foundation. As a climate scientist, how do you recommend that we respond to those kinds of challenges?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, for sure, this post-fact society. It's, you know, I think what I just mentioned about the projections versus the observations, I think is a powerful argument, in that, you know, what I heard for many years when I started this work was that we don't trust the projections. You know, that how can we plan out to 2100? We don't know what's going to happen next week if you look at, you know, a weather report. But I always point to the observations. You know, we can point to the warming we've already experienced. We can point to the warming that is inside our homes already. We can point to the warming that is regionally affecting people already, causing, you know, climate-related migration. And so I think that the observations are quite powerful because those are facts. But unfortunately, I think for many of the people who are arguing that none of this is real, it's going to start creeping into their lives in rather insidious ways. You know, I worked with some farmers for a while. This was maybe 10 years ago. But we would go to these community meetings and we would talk to them about what's been going on with their crops recently. And they would say, you know, it's a lot harder to grow what we used to grow. And it certainly sounds like a climate-driven kind of shift. But then when you ask them about climate change, they say, oh, but that's a hoax. And so there's this disconnect between their own observations and the kind of messaging that they've been getting externally. And so this is a big issue, particularly when it comes to things like sea level rise. I think we're going to see a lot of migration away from coasts, and it's not going to be because of climate change. It's going to be because insurance companies have pulled out. My home is uninsurable now. It's because they know that it's going to get flooded every year and they don't want to pay for it. So I think that these are going to be some kind of indirect ways that climate change is going to start creeping into these people's lives, and whether or not they attribute it specifically to climate change, we're going to see some changes as a result of it. So I don't know that we necessarily need to convince everyone that it is climate change that is the impetus for some of these adaptations that are necessary. But we can point to these observations, we can point to these impacts that it will have on their life, and we don't need to even call it climate change for us to see the kind of changes that we need.
Thank you. Others who want to add on this?
I'm sorry, I just have a follow-up question to that.
Yes, please.
I mean, now that we're talking about projections and how data has been very important, what do you feel could be priorities as researchers or as somebody we're building the science out of it? What do you feel are the research priorities, and where do the knowledge gaps lie? What do we have to prioritize as we go forward? Because 2030 we have a deadline, 2050 we have a deadline, and then we don't know what is going to happen. So what do you think are the priorities and gaps that we need to really think of and put it down on paper and say, hey, we need to think about this now?
Who would like to reply?
I mean, I can kick us off. This is an enormous question that I'm not sure any of us can answer fully, but I think we can answer it in pieces. And I think that one of the biggest gaps that I see in my work is just fully understanding the disparities here, the existing disparities, not even just the projections, as I mentioned, but about who exactly is affected and how. And there's so many voices that are left unheard right now, and exactly how they are being affected by this. And so I think that that is our highest priority right now, as I just mentioned, digging into what is already happening, I think should be one of our highest priorities.
And let me add that one of a key overarching objective of this week's Innovate for Cities conference is to revise the Global Research Action Agenda that the Global Covenant of Mayors and UN Habitat has produced. And so that really is what we're trying to do in this week-long conference, and the knowledge platform space that's been created for all of us to go in after these sessions and try and say from each session, what are we learning about the new kinds of knowledge that are necessary? We're trying to build that document, which then can be a resource for investigators and scientists globally, but also can be an input into the COP26 meetings next month.
If I can add,
Please.
Yeah, so I think it's important also, I think, in terms of how can we contextualize climate change at the local level for communities, and how can we make it something that they understand and feel the importance and urgency that we are feeling at the global or the national level for taking actions to be able to contribute to the larger goals that we have for reducing the climate change risks. So it needs to be, we need to figure it out. How do we contextualize it at a local level for someone living in a slum in an urban city, and the practices that they are adopting? How is it affecting the climate change in of that city, and how can we adapt to it as well?
Yes, Mikam.
I think for cities like in Hong Kong, I think my observation is that the biggest problem is people are quite indifferent to the current situation. We don't really have slums. We don't have horizontal slums. We have vertical slums, And, these people will never afford to live close to the waterfront because waterfront properties are very expensive. So, and our government also is quite difficult to really, we try very hard to hammer into their brain the importance of climate change. But if you know that they are actually planning to reclaim land from the middle of the sea, they're going to reclaim thousands of hectares of land. You know that even though Hong Kong recently pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050, but at the same time, you just cannot understand why they are creating this, climate risks, for ourselves. So I think the indifference, whether the poor people may be too busy about, worrying about their various other matters, so they may not be too concerned. They cannot really afford to be concerned. And then, others are really also not paying adequate attention. So to me, I think that's also a very important problem, in a more affluent society like Hong Kong.
Thank you. Lolia, you had a comment in the chat. Do you want to share it with us on screen?
Yes. So this is regarding what Evan was mentioning about, projections and trying to figure out what future scenarios would bring. And obviously, these are multiple scenarios that we need to prepare for. So my question is, how do we handle multi-risk impacts at local level, say, with respect to projected risks? And is it viable to create models which are localized around impact projections? And how do we navigate that research?
Well, I think we have quite a few answers to Machai's question about where we need the future research. As our time runs near the end of the hour, I have one more question I'd like to ask, and I won't direct it at anyone specifically. So if everyone will think about what they might want to say. The challenges, the kinds of solutions that are necessary to respond to the challenges of climate change are often quite radical or transformative. But when we work with residents in communities at the local level, there's often a resistance to significant transformative change because of the uncertainties involved. Residents want things that are incrementally different from what they know, and are reluctant to adopt substantial changes. And I'm thinking of changes like urban realignment, where we move a city from one place to another, or major changes in urban form, where we move people from living in single-family homes to living in high-rise apartment blocks that are remote from the threats, or that are flood-proofed more effectively. What can we do as planners who are working with communities to respond to the inherent conservative nature of the way residents engage with these questions, given that we want to engage residents and build solutions that they buy into? Heads are nodding, but no hands are going up.
I can say that the first thing that comes to my mind briefly is, unfortunately, we're still in a position right now of having to argue for the co-benefits of these. I mean, people need to know why we should do this and give me 10 reasons why. And fortunately for a lot of these, we have that many reasons. I mean, I have never once seen a cost-benefit analysis for enhancing urban canopy that was not highly positive. it's a good investment and with a variety of co-benefits. But unfortunately, we're still in a paradigm where we need to be arguing for that with as many co-benefits as possible. And so I think that's in terms of gaps, that's another big thing that we need to be focusing on. And in fact, that is a direction that I am seeing, at least in this country, is trying to gather as many of those as possible to make as strong of an argument as possible for why we should be doing it.
Thank you.
And if I can follow up on that and say, from a local authority perspective, because I still work as a local authority planner, while it is essential to really get the buy-in of residents, I think one area that it's essential that we look at is looking at what would the impact be. So sometimes if we get 50% buy-in or 70% buy-in, it might be that after the implementation, then we will be able to get the buy-in of maybe of 90% overall rather than the 100%. But it's also looking at the responsibility that we have as planners, not just to a certain group of residents or to a particular ideology that the residents have, but we have a responsibility to the community as a whole. And so bearing that in mind, then it's essential that while we're working with the residents, we are also letting them know what the limits are. At the end of the day, planners do have some powers, and so it's knowing when it's time to really use what we have for the benefit of everyone, rather than restrict, because we do not have time, like everyone has mentioned, there is no time. So in order to really implement within the time that we have, we need to use that power. And I can, even from a local authority perspective, I haven't seen any carbon reduction project that hasn't received objection from some residents of the community, even after the benefits are clearly stated in the application plans that have been submitted. So it's also looking at probably increasing the understanding of what is needed in the community, of the risk to the community if nothing is done ahead of time, and continuing communication about the changes that are about to happen, and creating that awareness so that it's not a shock. It's not 100% shock to residents, but it is that they are aware of the potential changes that could happen. And I also think another area that of the local authorities I've worked with, I've actually been very good at, is also providing the funding to support some residents that are not receptive to the changes that are coming in. And so sometimes it's 20% funding, sometimes it's 25% or 50% funding, particularly in the area of retrofitting the property for carbon reduction. So it's looking at these areas that we can support. But at the end of the day, we also have the enforcement power, the regulatory control power as planners, and we can also state that. So letting residents know that while we want to get the buy-in, we also have some powers if they are not receptive to the change.
Thank you, Olafian. Well, given the hour, let me try to say that what we have heard over this last hour and a half has been a persuasive case for the need for local processes and local solutions in response to climate change. The climate effects play out differently across different countries and different cities and even neighborhoods, and even buildings, as Evan has suggested, and effectively finding solutions that work given the diversity of institutional frameworks and cultures that we have, as well as physical realities that we have in communities around the world, really demands local processes for engaging and making these solutions. And we've heard lots of suggestions about the ways that our processes can be responsive to local interests and can productively integrate those local interests in finding solutions. I remember Mikem's discussion of the 3 Ps: peer pressure, persistent advocacy, and productive research. And yet we recognize that sometimes the populations in our communities are reluctant to take on the considerable changes that are necessary for the transformative solutions that are essential if we're going to respond to these challenges. And so we have to think about how to structure these processes, as some of you have said, in ways that are able to set the boundaries and move forward despite the reluctance in some communities. So it's been quite a discussion. Let me thank all the panelists and all the speakers and those who attended here in Zoom and those who've attended in the live stream. And let me turn things back over to Lolia Marie.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for hosting our eminent speakers and to navigating our session on localized risk and climate change implications with respect to spatial planning. Thank you all very much for joining. It has been an honor.
Good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.